Gaudete, gaudete, Christus es natus, ex Maria Virgine gaudete.
Welcome to the Rediscovery channel. This is the channel where I, Ivor Kovac, and my good friend Stilgar take turns coming up with topics from history that the other person doesn't know about and often hasn't heard about. However, today what I want to do is just kind of continue off from my last video that I posted where we talked about the life of JRR Tolkien, who is my all-time favorite author. And what I want to do now is talk about his philosophy. And the reason I want to do this is because there's all kinds of interest in his work, even now, as well as various groups that are trying to destroy his work and his legacy. And I think it's important to look at his philosophy, especially if you're interested in writing, because that will give you some kind of glimpse into how his world was developed. So what do you know about his philosophy, Stilgar, before we get into
I have no idea other than, what we discussed previously about his religion and faith. But I imagine that was part of his philosophy.
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know his specific philosophy, though.
So what I want to do is talk about that. And I'm probably going to break this video into two parts. So first, I want to go ahead and do some recap in case anybody is just tuning in for the first time. So J.R.R. Tolkien, he lived from 1892 to 1973. And of course, his most famous works are Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, and Silmarillion. The Silmarillion is the basis for his mythology, or the compendium of it, or I should say the final version of the compendium of his mythology. And it was the main thing that he wanted to publish, but that didn't actually get done until after he was dead. So Silmarillion was published in 1977 by his son Christopher. And of course, Tolkien, he created the world of Middle-earth, and his purpose for doing so was to create a set of mythology for England, and that was his driving goal. But instead, or maybe I shouldn't say instead, but the main impact culturally that he has is he becomes the father of modern fantasy. And there's all kinds of other products that have been created which are derivatives of his work, or inspired by his work, I should say, and even various attempts to kind of copycat his work. So there's so many products basically that would not exist if not for him. Anytime you see something that's got elves, dwarves, orcs, and humans all sharing a world together, then either it's something that was inspired directly by his Middle-earth, or it's inspired by something that's inspired by his work. So just to name a few things that wouldn't exist if not for Tolkien is the Elder Scrolls games. All of them would not exist. Dungeons and Dragons, Warcraft, not exist. Raid Shadow Legends, and then there's a series that one of my favorite sci-fi series is called Babylon 5, was also inspired by his work, even though it looks quite different on the surface. The guy that made that was a Tolkien fan, and if you know the history of Middle-earth, and you'll be able to see a lot of the similarities and inspiration. So that all being said, that's kind of the preamble. I want to go ahead and talk about his philosophy, and I think first we'll start with his Catholicism, because that is actually a rather huge influence, even though to the average person it's probably not apparent. So J.R.R. Tolkien, he joined the Catholic Church in the year 1900 when he was a little kid, and his mother brought him into it after his father was dead, and he remained in it until he died. Even though he was disturbed by some of the changes that occurred as he got older, he still remained in it. And he considered his mother to be a martyr for the faith, because after she converted, she was snubbed by family, like her biological family as well as in-laws, and it made life tougher for her, especially since her husband had passed away. And so the question is, why did he stick to it? In England, during his lifetime, there was a fairly strong anti-Catholic bias, and I believe that is actually much stronger than anything in the United States. So it did make his life a little tougher. Of course, whether or not the majority approves or disapproves of something isn't what makes something right or wrong. But what I want to do is, I have a quote from him, and he did believe the arguments, and you'll still see Catholics today will make this argument that they are the original church, and that everybody else is kind of an offshoot of them. And of course, it's interesting because Great Pharaoh, he's not here with us right now. Maybe he will return someday, but he had also told me that his church, at one point, he said his church, which is a Coptic Orthodox, was the original church, and everybody else kind of just was an offshoot of that. So, of course, I don't really want to get into that all kind of stuff, but I have a quote from him here regarding it. So what he said is, "Besides the sun, there may be moonlight, even bright enough to read by, but if the sun were removed, there would be no moon to see. What would Christianity now be if the Roman Church has in fact been destroyed?" So that comes from letter 250. And what I'll do is, I relied pretty heavily on the letters of JRR Tolkien for this topic. And I actually found a digital version online where you can download the PDF of his letters for free. So the link to that will be below. Everybody can check on this stuff directly if they want. So it's kind of getting to his belief, that they were the original church, and without them, the light would go out, basically. And then he did have something to say about the Protestant movement. So this is what he had to say about us, Stilgar. And this comes from letter 306. All right. So he says, "The Protestants search backwards for simplicity and directness, which, of course, though it contains some good, or at least intelligible motives, is mistaken and indeed vain, because primitive Christianity is now, and in spite of all research, will ever remain largely unknown, because primitiveness is no guarantee of value, and is and was in great part a reflection of ignorance. Grave abuses were as much an element in Christian liturgical behavior from the beginning as now. St. Paul's strictures on Eucharistic behavior are sufficient to show this. Still more, because my church was not intended by our Lord to be static or remain in perpetual childhood, but a living organism likened to a plant, which develops and changes in externals by the interaction of its bequeathed divine life and history, the particular circumstances of the world into which it is set. There is no resemblance between the mustard seed and the full-grown tree. For those living in the days of its branching growth, the tree is the thing. For the history of a living thing is part of its life, and the history of a divine thing is sacred. The wise may know that it began with a seed, but it is vain to try and dig it up, for it no longer exists, and the virtue and powers that it had now reside in the tree. Very good, but in husbandry the authorities, the keepers of the tree, must look after it according to such wisdom as they possess, prune it, remove cankers, rid it of parasites, and so forth, with trepidation, knowing how little their knowledge of growth is. But they will certainly do harm if they are obsessed with the desire of going back to the seed, or even to the first youth of the plant, when it was, as they imagine, pretty and unafflicted by evils. So, of course, anybody that wants to read this whole letter, feel free to go ahead. But basically, that was he viewed the Protestant movements as an attempt to reboot or reset, and thought that it was impossible to do so, and the correct approach was to stay in the church, the Catholic Church, and try to fix it if there's a problem there. So I don't really want to get into that is a whole another topic that we could probably do a video on as well. But basically that's his view. Of course, not all the Protestant movements were an attempt at starting over from the beginning. So like you could say that of I would say like the Baptist Church and some of the Pentecostal, I suppose, as well. But then you have others that are more liturgical that were just attempts at reform. And I don't want to really relitigate here all that stuff, but that is his view. So basically, he chose to stay in that. And
It was
if
against
anybody's
deconstruction.
Yeah, so like he did believe that it was. I mean, I think he put it very, very well, like his logic, I mean, I don't agree so much with it, but basically that's it. He thought it's impossible to go back to the early days, so and it's folly to try. So that and you can see that philosophy. He talks about that in other things, like there's another place where he says that it's foolish to destroy something to find out how it works. I mean, that's not an exact quote, but that's something else he said. That's my paraphrase of it. So,
well, I mean, given the times that he lived in with the First World War, I mean, there were a lot of people that wanted to, like, communism, I think, was a response also. Not so much. Anyway, that also wanted to destroy the society and rebuild it from the ground up. So maybe that was also partly a response to that, because I mean, communism was a big threat during those years. So
yeah, he also had some stuff to say about communism. He had his views about the Anglican Church were pretty harsh, but I decided not to include that here because that was stuff that he said when he was in his 20s. And as he got older, he got more chill on that. And his best friends were Protestants for most of his life. When he was young, it was some guy it was a Methodist guy. And when he was older, it was C.S. Lewis, who was Anglican. So, I mean, he had like, I guess you could say moderate views. But yeah, I think his comment makes sense, even though I would not, just saying what he says, just giving his argument, not really like trying to argue for it or against, but that was his view. And what I want to do now, move on from there, is talk about how Catholicism influenced his works. Because again, like you and me, we were not raised Catholic. So for us and most people, they're not going to get this stuff. But if you read his letters and do some research, then you'll find out. So here's a few things. And of course, some of this stuff is just general to Christianity as a whole. And then some of it is specifically from Roman Catholicism, or I should say specific to Roman Catholicism. So the first thing is Iluvatar, is the god that made the Middle Earth and the whole universe, is just another word for God. And it's like the Elvish word for God. So his universe is not like a pagan thing. The idea is it's still created by God. And if you read his letters, like in Silmarillion, he says Iluvatar. In his letters, he just says God, or the Lord and stuff like that. So that's how we know what he's talking about there. Then again, I guess you still haven't read the Silmarillion, but anybody that has, they'll know about Mandos. So Mandos is where humans and elves both go immediately after they die. And the location of Mandos is in Valinor, which is that big continent in the west. So where does he get this idea of Mandos from? Well, it functions exactly like purgatory. So anybody who wants to see like an example of it, like Beren and Luthien in the Silmarillion, when they die, they both go there, even though one is a human and one's an elf. Humans, they stay temporarily and leave. Elves usually stay temporarily and then they reincarnate. So humans and elves, they have different fates, but there is this mechanism there that is functionally like purgatory. And in case anybody has any doubts, I have a quote here. This comes from an earlier version of the Silmarillion called the later Quinta Silmarillion, and it's found in the book called Morgoth's Ring. And what he says is, "For there was for all the Fëanor of the dead a time of waiting, in which, howsoever they had died, they were corrected, instructed, strengthened, or comforted, according to their needs or deserts." What does that sound like, Stilgar?
I'm not sure.
Sounds like purgatory, right?
Yeah.
Where the Catholic Church, they're the only ones that believe in this. But basically, if you go to purgatory, you get judged, and I've heard, like, again, I don't know all the inner mechanics of the details of Catholicism, but basically, you go through a period of punishment or correction there, and then you go to heaven, or maybe you go to hell sometimes, depending. But why is it set physically in the world on this continent? Well, it turns out that Tolkien, he's not the first person to do that. Tolkien, he was also a fan of Dante. And Dante, if you read his work, he puts purgatory as a physical place in the world. Of course, he doesn't put it on the Western continent. He puts it in like Antarctica, below the equator. So, yeah. So Tolkien's not the first one to do that. Dante actually did it first. And regarding Dante, he said, "I do not seriously dream of being measured against Dante, a supreme poet." That was in a letter where somebody had asked him or accused him of talking bad about Dante, and this is what he said in return, letter 294. And since I read actually for Dante, I only read Inferno, but I know a little bit about the next two books, All the Divine Comedy, and having read both of them, I can see the shared influence. So moving right along.
No, so do you think he actually believed in purgatory because he put it in his in the Silmarillion?
That is a good question. He doesn't really talk about purgatory in his letters, or at least that I remember.
Okay.
But it was an official teaching of the church, and it still is today.
Yeah, I wonder if we have any Catholic listeners, if they really believe in purgatory. It's just, yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, if anybody believes in purgatory, or
or maybe you're Catholic and you don't believe in purgatory, will be interesting to hear as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear feedback from everybody. And the Catholic Church is the only one that has the teaching of purgatory. Eastern Orthodox, they don't believe in purgatory, but they do believe that if you pray for the dead, it can potentially make a difference. So they have a practice of praying for the dead, at least in theory, but they don't know if it's actually going to do anything, but they do it anyways. So when I first read Silmarillion and I read about Mandos and the afterlife and everything, I kind of connected it with, I thought of it as something more like Greek mythology of like Hades.
Yeah.
And Elysian Fields, that kind of thing. But actually it's clearly connected with purgatory, and that's how it functions. But if he had been a Protestant or Orthodox, there probably wouldn't have been any Mandos. That humans would straight go to heaven or hell. Elves would. I mean, he wanted to do his own different set of rules for the elves. Like, that's the main thing that makes them different than humans, is they have a different fate. Like, they just get recycled back into the world, whereas humans leave the world. So The next thing that comes from the Catholic Church, which you may or may not have heard about, is they actually divided the world up into 6 or 7 ages. Have you heard of that before?
Can you repeat that one more time? Sorry.
Like the Catholic Church actually divided the world up into ages.
No, I did not know that. No.
Yeah, it was done by Saint Augustine of Hippo, and he divided the world into 6 ages, but sometimes they would also add a 7th age. So, according to this view, the first age goes from the creation of Adam to the flood. That's the first age. The second age is from the end of the flood to Abraham. Third age is from Abraham to David. Fourth age is beginning with the life of David. I should say Abraham to the birth of David. Fourth age is David and his life to the Babylonian exile. Fifth age is the exile to the birth of Jesus. The sixth stage is the time of Jesus to his second coming. And sometimes what they will do is refer to the time after the return of Jesus when he physically comes back to the world as the 7th age. So, as you know, Middle Earth is divided up into ages as well. The Silmarillion covers the events of the first and second ages, and Lord of the Rings and Hobbit are set in the third age. And then if you read the appendix in the back of Return of the King, where it talks about some of the after events, that stuff is set into the fourth age. So how well does it line up with the Catholic ages of the world? So the first age in Middle Earth, and this is coming off the top of my head, is the creation of Arda to the time where they incarcerate Morgoth. They lock him up forever. And then the second age is from the fall of Morgoth to the fall of Numenor. And after that, the world is broken and made round. And then the third age is the time from that all the way to the return of the king when Aragorn gets his crown. Actually, the main thing is the destruction of the ring, which happens before Aragorn gets his crown. And that is significant because after that, evil no longer takes like a physical form, and the rings of power that the high elves have all stop working. So then the fourth age is from the destruction of the ring to I don't know what. But there's Tolkien, he said in letter 211 that right now we are probably in the 6th or the 7th age. And what he says here, I imagine the gap to be about 6,000 years. That is, we are now at the end of the 5th age. If the ages were about the same length as second age and third age, but they have, I think, quickened, and I imagined we are actually at the end of the 6th age or in the 7th. So he's not really following exactly what St. Augustine put down, but it seems like his ages were inspired by this. It's not like I'd say inspired by it, possibly. And there's also, a quote. Let's see, there's also something you can read from Morgoth's Ring, another one of the stories that didn't make it into the final publication. It's called the Athrobeth Finrod Andreth, which translated into English is the debate of Finrod and Andreth. And it's a debate between Finrod, who's one of the high kings of the Noldor, one of the ancient high elves, with a human woman. And they talk about things like why how elves are immortal, but humans are mortal, and why is it humans have to die. And one of the things they say is in that debate is eventually Iluvatar is going to physically come into the world. So my guess is that the coming of Jesus is probably what changes the 5th age to the 6th age in Tolkien's mind. And as for what changes the fourth age into the fifth age, or what makes his world start to physically look like our world in terms of geography and culture, I'm thinking it's probably what makes the difference between the fourth age and the fifth age, but I'm not really sure. And I don't really see where the global flood would fit into, or Noah's flood would fit into his mythology, or how it would fit. But the Catholic Church, I shouldn't say the whole church, but at least some of the priests suppose that maybe the flood of Noah didn't quite destroy the whole earth, which I'll come to in a bit here, because I've got something on that I also discovered. Let's see. So another thing is, he said that his perception of beauty, both in majesty and simplicity, is founded on the Virgin Mary. And that he says in letter 142. And after reading this, I looked up a bunch of images for the Roman Catholic depictions of Mary. And in some of the images, they show Mary with like a halo of stars or a crown of stars. And anybody can look this up and see. I'll also put some images in the slideshow. And it looks like Varda, also known as Elbereth, which is one of the Valar that's mentioned in the Silmarillion, is inspired by the Catholic depictions of the Virgin Mary. According to letter 213, he says, or more important, I am a Christian, which can be deduced from my stories, and in fact a Roman Catholic. The latter fact perhaps cannot be deduced, though one critic by letter asserted that the invocations of Elbereth and the character of Galadriel, as directly described, or through the words of Gimli and Sam, were clearly related to the Catholic devotion of Mary. So Varda, or Elbereth, is one of the Valar that helps physically shape the world during the First Age. And anybody who's read the Silmarillion will know what I'm talking about. Anybody who hasn't read the Silmarillion, I highly recommend it. After having read the descriptions of Varda, which is in the Silmarillion, she has black hair, and she places the stars in the sky. That's what she's responsible for. And then having searched images for the Virgin Mary, I can see kind of where he got his idea from for her physical appearance. And I don't think that the Roman Catholic biblical art is very accurate in terms of how these people actually looked. But that's where he gets his inspiration from, at least for this particular character. And, that doesn't mean that Varda is Mary. Tolkien, he did not write allegory, but it rather that she's inspired by that imagery to a certain degree, but not meant to be taken as though she is Mary. It's too early for that. And then next thing I want to get to here is the medieval cosmology, because we've talked about this in other videos, Tolkien's Middle Earth, the way that it's arranged, doesn't really fit that well with what we know about the physical structure of our world today and the universe and the solar system, but it is quite similar to the view that was taught during the medieval period. So Middle Earth bears quite a few similarities to the Ptolemaic cosmology, much more so than it does to our world. One of those is the geocentric cosmology, with the sun and the moon going around the Earth. And then another overlap is some of the creatures and species that were thought to live in the world during the medieval period, where our ancestors, they couldn't really get out of Europe for the most part because they're surrounded by all kinds of enemies, particularly Islam in the Middle East and North Africa, and you have the Huns and Mongols to the east. So it was, it's between the period between the Roman Empire and the Age of Exploration, and the Catholic Church and the so-called scientific establishment and the historians and everything could only speculate about what lay elsewhere in the world. Can't really go there and see it for yourself. And there's a lot of rehashing of older ideas from ancient Greek explorers, actually, that had gone, to India and further down into Africa, that kind of stuff. So if anybody wants to know more about that, we have our video on the medieval worldview, the medieval cosmology. And then the third thing that's like a really big overlap between the medieval cosmology and Tolkien's world is that both place the starting point of humanity in the Far East. So why do the elves start in, the elves, they start in a place called Cuiviénen, and the humans start in Hildoria. Cuiviénen is almost to the east coast. It's in an area that would roughly correspond with eastern China today. And then the humans start right on the coast. So why is that? Well, during the medieval period, the Catholic Church used to teach that the Garden of Eden was in the Far East, not in the Middle East, but in the Far East. And so what I want to do now here is read a little bit from the Book of Marvels and Travels, written by Sir John Mandeville. And this book was, again, I've mentioned this in other videos, but this book was believed to be written by a French priest. But it's written from the perspective of an English knight by the name of Sir John Mandeville, who never actually existed, but he writes this book. It's written from the perspective of this English knight that actually went and traveled and visited all these places before it was really easy or possible for Europeans to do that. So here is what they said regarding, or what they believed regarding the location of the Garden of Eden, which, again, the medieval church, they believed that Eden had somehow made it through the flood, managed to survive. If you look at the medieval world maps, the Mapi Mundi, you'll often see in the Far East a little circular area or an enclosed area, and you might see two faces or the image of a tree with a snake in the tree, or two people standing underneath the tree, that kind of stuff. It's intended to represent the Garden of Eden, and the circle is like the wall of fire or the force field or whatever that the angels put around, that God put around it and had angels guarding. So at any rate, here's what Sir John Mandeville said. For to the east beyond these islands and the land of Prester John and the deserts over which he rules, one will find only mountains and great rocks and dark lands where one cannot discern day or night according to local people. This desert and land of darkness lasts all the way to the earthly paradise where Adam and Eve were placed. They were only there a little while. It is to the east, at the very beginning of the world. However, it's not our east, the one where the sun rises for us, because when the sun rises in this region, it's actually midnight in our country on account of the roundness of the earth. Indeed, our Lord made the earth entirely spherical in the middle of the firmament, as I've previously explained. I can't really describe paradise properly because I haven't been there, and that grieves me. However, I'll describe what I've heard from wise men. People say that the earthly paradise is the highest region in the whole world, and it is so high that it nearly touches the sphere of the moon, so high that Noah's flood, which covered all the surrounding land, couldn't touch it. Paradise is entirely enclosed by a wall. People don't know what the wall is made from. The whole wall is overgrown with something like moss, so people can't see the stone or whatever else it is made from. The highest place in paradise, in the very middle, is a spring discharging 4 rivers that run through different lands. The first river is called the Faison, or Ganges, and that runs through India. There are many precious gems in that river, plenty of wood from the tree called Lignum aloes, and much gold sand. Another river is called the Nile, or Gihon, and that runs through Ethiopia and Egypt. The third river is called the Tigris, and that runs through Asia and Greater Armenia. The fourth river is called the Euphrates, and that runs through Media, Armenia, and Persia. Local people say that all the sweet fresh waters of the world flow from this spring. So in Genesis, it does name these rivers, the Pison, the Gihon, Tigris, and Euphrates. Today, and also back during the medieval period, there's rivers in the Middle East called Tigris and Euphrates. Mm-hmm. Whether or not those are the original Tigris and Euphrates before the flood is, extremely debatable. I find it unlikely. But our ancestors, they thought, and the church pushed this, that those are the same rivers and that they still flow out of paradise. And,
which would be like in Himalayas or something?
No, it's to the east. Like it's to the east of India altogether.
Okay.
And then later on, when they found out that China was probably a real place, then they put it to the east of China. And eventually, when the age of exploration began, then this whole idea was put to rest permanently. But that's where they placed the origin point of humanity throughout the whole Middle Ages. And I don't think the Catholic Church still believes this stuff, but I mean, they did teach it for hundreds of years. And of course, Tolkien, he would have known that. And it's not a coincidence that he chose in his world to put the starting points of humanity and elves about where the medieval church said it would be, And I'll put maps of all this stuff, including maps of his world that shows where these places are. So regarding, the church sanctioning and teaching this view, I want to read from the last chapter and page here of the Book of Marvels and Travels. There's this little paragraph, which is kind of interesting. So here he says, because many people only believe that which they've seen with their own eyes and that which they can conceive of with their own human reason, I traveled homewards on a route via Rome. This was in order to show my book to the Holy Father, the Pope, and describe to him the marvels I had seen in different countries. So with this wise counsel, he might examine it with different peoples in Rome, because there are always people living there from all kinds of nations around the world. A little later, when he and his wise counsel had thoroughly examined my book, he told me that, for certain, everything therein was true. Indeed, he said that he owned a Latin book containing all this and much more, according to which the book Mappi Mundi is made, a copy of which book he showed me. Therefore, the Holy Father, the Pope, has ratified and confirmed my book in all topics. And I mean, after having read this book, it's almost like somebody was just looking at one of these Mappi Mundis that used to hang in the churches and writing about how he visited all these places. Maybe, in fact, maybe that's exactly what happened. But, it is. So in case anybody's wondering, and maybe somebody's like annoyed with me for going this far on this one, but that is why, most likely the reason why he put the starting place of humans way in the east in Hildorian, like all the way against the east coast, and the starting point of elves almost that far, is because that was a church teaching for so long. When I was a kid, what they said is it's either in the Middle East, wherever the Garden of Eden was. They say it's either it was in the Middle East or we have no idea where it was. But if we were alive 1,000 years ago, this is what they'd be telling us. That's further to the east of India. All right. So any questions on that, or?
No, makes sense.
Yeah. And that was one of the things that, as I read the Silmarillion and then I started looking at the maps and the histories of the Middle Earth, I was like, why is he putting it all the way over there? So that's why. Most likely that's why. And there's other similarities, between his world and the ancient medieval worldview, basically. So another thing is Tolkien, he did not believe in evolution, which was being pushed pretty hard back then. And of course, it's still being pushed pretty hard now, today, Although now they're actually moving on. They might be getting ready to move on to something else. I've been seeing news articles about that. But he didn't believe in evolution, and he thought that the Bible was still good. But he did believe that the world could be very old, and that lots of ages, maybe an unknown amount of time, might have passed between the fall of man and the flood. And I have a quote on this, which comes from letter 96, in case anyone wants to read the whole letter. He says, I do not now feel either ashamed or dubious on the Eden myth. Myth is in quotes. It has not, of course, historicity of the same kind as the New Testament, which are virtually contemporary documents, while Genesis is separated by we do not know how many sad exiled generations from the fall, but certainly there was an Eden on this very unhappy earth. We all long for it, and we are constantly glimpsing it, our whole nature at its best and least corrupted, its gentlest and most humane. It's still soaked with the sense of exile. And this is something that comes up in quite a few of his letters, and it also is in the debate of Finrod and Andrath, where the characters are talking about it, how humans are not satisfied with the world because we have an idea of how things are supposed to be from the time that our ancestors spent in paradise. And it's a theme that he talks about with his son, Christopher, that you can read in some of his other letters, including this one. And it does factor into his stories as well. So everybody should understand that. And then there's one thing that he mentions in the letter, which is kind of interesting. And this is regarding end times eschatology. And he says, still, I think there will be a millennium, the prophesied 1,000-year rule of the saints, i.e., those who have for all their imperfections never finally bowed heart and will to the world or the evil spirit in modern but not universal terms, mechanism, scientific materialism, socialism in either of its factions now at war. So if you read the Silmarillion, it does talk a little bit about what happens at the end of the world. Things are going to be made right, and certain characters like Turin Bar are going to return into the world, and like Morgoth will return, and then he'll be crushed permanently. So it is kind of again, like his writing doesn't just come from nowhere. There is stuff that inspired him, and of course it goes through the filter of his religion, and a lot of his religious beliefs are just general things that, like, I would say all Bible believing Christians have in common. And then of course some things are specific to Catholicism. But at any rate, I think I'm gonna stop this one here for now, and the rest of his ideas and philosophy we'll put in a separate entry. So do you have anything to say on this one, Stilgar? Do you want to add?
No, I mean, I'd like to learn more. Yeah, I had some questions, but I didn't want to go out like on a tangent on some of these things. So,
all right.
No, let's keep talking, and then maybe we can keep some of the stuff for at the end of the final video.
All right, so yeah. I'm gonna cut this one here, and I'll say to everybody, thanks for listening, and then the next one will cover the rest of his ideas, which are pretty interesting, and you can ask all the questions that you want, if I haven't satisfactorily covered everything. So, alrighty, do leave us a comment below. Anybody who's listening, I would say thanks for listening. And if you have any requests, comments, do leave those for us. We take everything very seriously. So, until the next one, then.
Deus homo factus est natura mirante, unus renovatus est a Christo regnante. Gaudete, Christus est natus, ex Maria Virgine gaudete.